Good evening, here's Top News English newsletter starting with headlines. Syrian army regains control over areas in Deir ez-Zor and foils infiltration attempts. Hamas accepts call for 3-hour humanitarian truce. ISIS claims wave of Baghdad bombings. And heavy clashes erupt around Tripoli airport. Welcome to details. Syrian army on Saturday carried out successful operations against armed terrorist groups in many areas across the country, killing a number of terrorists and injuring others. Army units carried out a string of accurate operations against terrorist dens and gatherings in eastern Ghouta and several towns and villages in Damascus countryside. Army troops destroyed terrorists' hideouts with the weapons and ammunition inside in several areas in Jobar neighborhood, killing and wounded several terrorists. Meanwhile, army soldiers carried out an accurate operation in the farms of Zabdin town, killing many Islamist army terrorists who tried to sneak into Al-Maliha town. An army unit carried out several operations in Qalamun Mountains region. A source in Deir ez-Zor said that units of army regained full control over Al-Ayyash and Al-Bujum'a villages. In Aleppo and its countryside, units of the armed forces continued their operations against the terrorists' gatherings and their dens in a number of neighborhoods, inflicted heavy losses upon them. In Dar'a countryside, army units targeted the gatherings of terrorists in several areas as a number of them were killed and others were injured while a number of their vehicles were destroyed. In Hama, a source said that army units continued operations in several areas in Murek town in Hama northern countryside, tightening control over several buildings blocks after eliminating entire terrorist groups in the southern area of the town. President Bashar al-Assad issued Saturday Decree number 228 naming Dr. Najah al-Attar Vice President. Based on the decree, al-Attar will be charged with the following up on the implementation of the cultural policy in the framework of the President's directives. In occupied Palestine, the Israeli regime says it's expanding the ground offensive in the Gaza Strip as the bloodiest conflict since 2008 has entered its 13th day with a death toll of 352 martyrs. The army began the ground offensive late on Thursday after 10 days of aerial and naval bombardment of the besieged Palestinian territory. According to the Israeli military, since the ground operation began, 3 soldiers troopers have been killed, including 2 in a firefight with Hamas fighters inside Israeli territory. Army Chief of Staff Lieutenant Colonel Benny Gantz warned on Friday that as Israel expanded the ground operation, there would be moments of hardship, alluding to the possibility of further Israeli casualties. Moreover, at least 40 people were killed and nearly 400 wounded in Israeli shelling of Gaza's northeastern Shuja'iyya district overnight, medics said on Sunday. Emergency services spokesman Ashraf al-Qudra said 40 bodies had been retrieved from the neighborhood and at least 380 people had been wounded in shelling that was still continuing. The Islamist Hamas movement said on Sunday it had accepted a proposal for a 3-hour humanitarian ceasefire in Gaza it said was made by the International Committee of the Red Cross. The International Committee of the Red Cross contacted us and offered to broker a 3-hour humanitarian truce to enable ambulances to evacuate the dead and wounded, and Hamas accepted it, spokesman Sami Abu Zuhri said in a statement. Hamas agreed on it, but the occupation refused it, he claimed, although Israeli public radio reported that the Israeli government was studying the proposal. An ICRC spokesman refused to confirm or deny the report, saying only we have been making every effort to ensure ways to evacuate the dead and the wounded. The move came as Israel continued pounding several neighborhoods east of Gaza City, leaving at least 40 people dead and nearly 400 wounded. The intensity of the bombardment prevented emergency services from accessing the neighborhoods, and dead bodies lay in the streets and thousands fled in terror. Qatar Qatar will host a meeting between Palestinian President Mahmoud Abbas and UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon Sunday to try to push for an end to fighting in the Gaza Strip that has killed more than 300 people, a senior Qatari source said. Due to take place in Doha, the meeting will be chaired by the Gulf States Emir Tamim bin Hamad Al Thani, who has been acting as a channel of communication between the Islamist Hamas group and the international community, said the source. In Iraq, the Islamic State of Iraq and Syria has claimed responsibility for a wave of car bombs in mostly Shiite areas of Baghdad, which killed at least 27 people Saturday. The hardline Takfiri Islamist organization, which has led an offensive across northern and western Iraq, said two of the explosions were suicide missions by bombers it named Abu Qatada al-Almani and Abu Abdurrahman al-Shami, which suggested they were from Germany and Syria. Saturday's blasts were the deadliest in the Iraqi capital since the Takfiri insurgency erupted in the northern city of Mosul and then swept through Sunni regions of Iraq towards Baghdad. The first suicide bombing took place at a checkpoint where soldiers, police and child volunteer fighters were gathered, the Islamic State said in an internet statement. The other struck Al-Qadimiyya, the site of major Shiite shrine. At the same time, two car bombs were set off in the west of the capital. The toll of these blessed operations was the killing and wounded of 150 people, the statement said, warning of greater attacks to come. Moreover, in Iraq, Western countries will end up fighting insurgents who have overrun large parts of Iraq on their own doorstep unless they intervene to combat the threat at its source, a senior Kurdish security official said in an interview. Masroor Barzani, head of the Kurdish region's National Security Council, said he doubted Iraq's army would be able to roll back militant gains without help from outside, but that the world did not appear serious about confronting the insurgency. Iraq's million-strong army, trained and equipped by the United States at a cost of around $25 billion, largely evaporated in the north after militants from the Islamic State of Iraq and Syria overran the city of Mosul last month. From there, they went on to seize most Sunni majority areas with little resistance, putting Iraq's very survival as a unified state in jeopardy as politicians wrangle in Baghdad over forming a government. Barzani said Kurdistan, which has managed so far to insulate itself against violence in the rest of Iraq and neighboring Syria, was the front line against terrorism in the Middle East, and that the inaction of Western nations was at their peril. They have a choice: either they can come and face them here, or they can wait for them to go back to their own countries and face terrorism on their doorsteps, he said in an interview on Saturday. The Peshmerga have already clashed with insurgents who are now armed with weapons seized from the Iraqi army, many of them supplied by the United States, which has urged the Kurds to take on ISIS. In Libya, heavy fighting has erupted around Tripoli International Airport, where rival militants have been battling for a week for control of the site, local residents said on Sunday. The fighting broke out just days after one powerful militia said it was ready to put an end to heavy clashes that had deepened fears the North African country is becoming a failed state. There were no immediate reports of casualties from Sunday's clashes. The airport standoff pits fighters from Zintan in the northwest, who control the airport since the ousting of Gaddafi, against armed groups tied to Misrata, a western coastal town. Both are loosely allied with competing Islamist and nationalist political factions. The clashes have all but suspended international flights from Libya, damaged more than a dozen planes parked there, and prompted the United Nations to pull its staff out of the North African country because of security fears. And finally, in Ukraine, international monitors and Ukrainian officials say that armed rebels forced emergency workers to hand over all 196 bodies recovered from the Malaysia Airlines crash site and have loaded them onto refrigerated trains. Russian news agencies said that the bodies were heading to the rebel stronghold of Donetsk. Ukrainian officials say that they expect to have the bodies eventually delivered to government-held city Kharkiv, but it's unclear if the rebels will agree to do so. That's all for today. Thanks for joining us. I'm Dima Yunus. Good night.